I'm very happy to welcome Bernhard from the Friedrich Alexander Universität in Erlangen, Nürnberg. That's a mouthful. So Bernhard holds the chair for visual computing in Erlangen, and he is a recently appointed, correct me if I'm wrong, Adidas professor. That sounds really cool. And he's got some really interesting publications on face identity, but from a slightly different aspect than I cover with the work that my collaborators and I do. So that's why I was really excited to meet Bernhard at VSS in the context of a discussion, and then we've just kept in touch. And so I'm really happy that you'll be presenting your work today. We are recording the talk so that we can provide it for those who weren't able to join us today. And yeah, thank you very much, Bernhard.
Cool. Thanks for having me today. So my background is probably really quite a bit different than most of yours, or that's just what I'm assuming. I studied computer science, so I'm a computer vision researcher, but spent almost all my scientific life working on faces, and that's probably where a lot of our interests might overlap. So yeah, the title of my presentation is like I almost use always same or similar titles, and then I start to change the presentation for the actual talk, and then it always is something different hidden behind the different titles. So don't overvalue the title, please. First, I would just quickly tell everybody who I am, because I guess nobody knows me. Mike knows me, but nobody else. I did my PhD in Basel. At the University of Basel in the group of Thomas Fetter. And I already started in that group in my master's thesis. And my master's thesis was on a very applied problem, namely to find out what the relationship between a face and a skull is. So given the 3D skull, how would the face look like, and vice versa. That has animation applications in forensics and also in animation. In my PhD, I then switched to image analysis. So given a 2D image, could we reconstruct the 3D face behind that 2D image? I then also did a small side trip during my master's and also did an upper secondary school teaching diploma. That's not super relevant for today. I will not show you the smileys, but I also have some fun smileys that explain all the shape modeling stuff for high school students. After my PhD, I went to the US, so I got money from the Swiss National Science Foundation to do a postdoc there. And the first thing I worked on there were the lateral ventricles in the human brain, and we tried to find out if there is a relationship between white matter hyperintensities in the brain and the outcome of stroke patients. And what you see here in red is basically how much of those hyperintensities are in a certain direction. Are you actually still there? Because I somehow lost, yeah. Before I had, now I have a small video of you. Perfect, cool. And after looking at those lateral ventricles in the brain, I went back to faces and I explored various different directions there. That was in the lab of Josh Tenenbaum. So some of those projects had a motivation more from a cognitive science or neuroscience direction. And if I'm not doing research, I'm a passionate scuba diver and glider pilot, and I really enjoy nature from above and below. Mike already mentioned it before. The university is very hard to pronounce correctly. You did a good job on that. It's the best university I've never heard of. It's in the almost middle of Germany, in Erlangen, that's in Bavaria. And we have the biggest outdoor beer festival here, and we have the biggest density of breweries. So it's definitely worth to visit, and we also have great science and a great university. Before I will show you what I'm actually working on, I would like to start with this image here. And for you, that might actually be more familiar than if I show an image like that to computer scientists. It might look like a Mooney image to you. And for me, it's very surprising how much we can perceive from images like this one. Because from an information theoretic or a computer science directive perspective, there is something wrong with the, give me 1 second.
This is the point where we can do like PowerPoint. What would he have said?
Sorry?
So this is the point where we could start doing some PowerPoint karaoke.
Yeah.
That would have said.
You can just continue the presentation without me. Yeah. So from a computer vision researcher perspective, or from a information theoretic perspective, it's quite surprising how much information is still contained in this image after this very strong degradation of the image. So it's heavily blurred. So all the high frequency details are lost, and it's also threshold. It's just black and white. And I guess all of you kind of get a strong percept of what we can see in that image. You can see faces, you might see a table, laptops. You can even interpret the whole scene. So this whole Mooney thing is usually studied very isolated, that people only look at faces or one object, but it actually works for whole room scenes. And some of you might also be able to retrieve an image that you have seen in the past. This one here. It was in the news, so you might have seen it. And if I would show you an image like this, the task would of course be much easier. And that task is also a task that the computer vision system today can solve, or at least parts of it. So a computer vision system in this image could detect faces. It could probably also estimate where those people are looking at. It might even realize that there is a common point of interest. But if we look at that image, we get a much more rich percept. We could even interpret why those people are looking at this common point of interest and what might be located there. So our reasoning goes beyond the actual image, and we can also reason for stuff that's happening outside of the image space. And if you look a little bit longer, and that's works particularly well in in-person presentations, and there's always one guy who's just looking on the laptop. In this case, it might be the person steering the presentation or whatever is going on the TV. So what I would like to do in my research is to analyze images like this, or also the Mooney image that you have seen before, and try to get this rich percept. So to really parse the scene, to find out what's happening in the scene, and to also make it robust. So to make it work even for images like the one you have seen, the Mooney image. And you could say, okay, that's just what almost every computer vision researcher tries to achieve. So yes, this motivation is very broad, but I think in particular this generalization topic in the Mooney phase direction is the one that I would say is my focus. So if I would present this in terms of my research goals, I would like to build vision systems that are data efficient and compute rich percepts. The methods I'm using for that are analysis by synthesis methods and generative models. And there's kind of a second pillar of my research, and that's I would like to understand how human perception works with those computational models. That's probably the pillar you're more interested in. And the things I'm doing there are like psychophysics experiments. I'm in particular interested in the long tail of the perception and the generalization, like the thing you have seen with the Mooney phases before. And also the neuroscience part or the imaging part is something I'm not doing myself. For that, I usually rely on collaborators that actually know how that stuff works. So the first pillar is more like machine learning, computer vision. The second pillar is computational cognitive science and neuroscience. I don't see them as separated. I think if we would have better computer vision systems, we will probably also better understand how the human brain works. And if we would better understand how the human brain works, we could also build better computer vision systems. It might be time for a PowerPoint karaoke again. No? All good. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what I mean when I say we want to build vision systems in an analysis by synthesis manner. So one part of analysis by synthesis is the synthesis, and that's the generative model that we use. And for this, we basically use standard computer graphics. What you see on top are faces. On the left, you see the face shapes, and on the top right, you see the face textures. So we have the shape of the face, we have the texture of the face, and then we would like to render an image. And rendering means that we go from this 3D face to a 2D image. And what we have to do to get there is we have to add a camera model. So that's if you take a photograph to kind of say what's the pose of the face, and we have to add light to the scene, and then we get a 2D image in a random pose. And that's basically standard computer graphics. And the way we would now like to solve computer vision is by just basically invert this rendering pipeline and just try to reverse all those steps. So going from the 2D image that we have, we would like to estimate the camera parameters, the illumination condition, the 3D shape of the face or the object, and also the texture of the face and the object. And that problem is heavily ill-posed, and that's also what the second bigger part of my presentation will actually be about. And because it's an ill-posed problem, so we will have some ambiguities, and one of them we will dive a little bit deeper into. And we would of course like to not only make that working for synthetic face renderings like you see here on the bottom, but also for real images. The model that we're using is a so-called 3D Morphable model. You might have seen that before. It's a 23-year-old idea that was presented at a computer graphics conference. And the idea is pretty simple. You take around 200 faces, 3D scans of faces. You establish dense correspondence. So you find things like the tip of the nose, points on the cheek, corner of the mouth, corner of the eye. And then you build a statistical model, and that's usually just built using principal component analysis. The model that I'm building here is using coupler component analysis. That's a variant of principal component analysis that enables you to include also attributes into your model. And the attributes that we collected together with the scans were age, height, weight, and sex. So those were the attributes that I then included into the model building. The dataset was collected in Basel, so you can also see that there is a very strong bias that model is not representing the world population very properly. It's more like the Basel Swiss young student population. What we do then, if we get a new target image, is that we would like to find an image called the fit. And the fit is basically the image that results of this rendering pipeline that you have seen before when you have the model parameters. So, and this is the theta here. So what we would like to do is to find all those model parameters that fit this target image best. And you can imagine that as a simple function. It's the rendering function. So you have some rendering parameters P. Those are the illumination and camera parameters. And then you have some alphas, and you can imagine that as a linear combination of all the faces that we have seen before. So we are basically trying to explain this target image by a linear combination of faces that we have seen before and try to re-render it. And if we are able to re-render it, then that's exactly the analysis by synthesis idea. Then we basically understand the face in this image, and we get the 3D reconstruction of the face in this image. The method that we are using is a probabilistic one. It's a Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling method, but there are various different methods that were tried out in the last 20 years, how you can solve that problem. And of course, neural network-based methods are also heavily used at the moment to solve this problem. So the result of this analysis by synthesis is that we feed in this input image and we get out a parameterized representation of the face. And we can re-render that face under new poses, under different illumination conditions. And if you use this coupler component analysis model, we also get the attributes from this image analysis. We go back to the image that I showed you in the beginning. We can, of course, run this whole pipeline framework on all the faces that you see here. And what you get is an image like that. And it's a bit hard to see because it's overlaid over the image. So let's remove the image, and I only show you the reconstructions now. If you look very closely, you can of course see all the biases in the data set. So Hillary Clinton got very young, and Barack Obama lost some color. So that's basically reflecting the strong bias of young people from Basel in this image analysis task now. And we would also get the attributes. And the attributes are okay-ish. I did an evaluation for the male-female attribute, but for the age, the population that we built the model is just not rich enough. To learn more about morphable models, we wrote an actually pretty nice review paper that I'm super proud of, that basically summarizes all the research that happened around 3D morphable models, all the different steps that have to be done. It also has tables, which models are publicly available, which algorithms to use those models are publicly available, and also an application part. And now I would just like to show you 3 or 4 projects, how we have used 3D morphable models in the last few years, and what the current projects are that I'm involved in that direction. So the one that's the newest basically happened last week. I think it's all fine. Apple, he's saying Apple, okay. So this paper we put on arXiv last week, and this paper aimed at a robust method to reconstruct faces from 2D images. So basically exactly what I showed you before, but in a robust way. So if you have glasses on, or if parts of your face are occluded, we would still like to be able to reconstruct this 3D face. There is one benchmark out there, that's the Now Challenge. And our method is currently at the top of this Now Challenge. So I'm of course super proud of Chun Lu, who made that possible. And we hope that we can stay up on this first place as long as possible. The surprising thing is that our method is actually really using the classical model that's 23 years old. And all the other methods that you see in this list, or most of them, use some kind of advanced nonlinear model. So we basically show here that the fitting part can cope for a lot of issues with the small details. Another project that we recently published that was at AAAI is a novel method to do image manipulation based on 3D morphable models. We called it MoSt-GAN, or in Swiss German, MoSt-GAN. And the basic idea is you feed an input image, you would like to adapt the 3D morphable model, and you would then make a change on the 3D model and render the change back to the image. Can you actually hear Leo in the background? And is it annoying or is it okay? It's okay? Okay, good. The main contribution in this paper was that we combined morphable models with style GANs. So style GAN is currently one of the nicest techniques to generate 2D face images, but the problem is that they are limited to frontal images and you can't really do consistent changes. So our method here enables to combine the benefits of the photorealistic generation with the benefits of having a 3D morphable model. So Skylar Sutherland worked on a project that might actually be interesting for you because it's motivated from a cognitive science perspective. And one thing we were wondering is that there are researchers that believe that the 3D morphable model might be a computational model for what's going on in the brain, because it's a statistical model. And then the question would be, how could such a model be learned? How could the human brain acquire such a model? Because we are not running around with a 3D scanner, and the modeling is also not, it might just not be exactly the way how it works. So we were wondering what could be the minimal thing that you have to build into a brain that we could learn such a 3D morphable model. So what we did in this project is we took all the training data and we threw it away. And we said, okay, we just use one single data point to build a morphable model. And that single data point is just the average face. And we also tried degraded versions of the average face, like with a reduced resolution on shape and with a reduced resolution on texture. And then from that single data point, we started to add random deformations. So here you can see that there are some shape deformations, but there are also some weird color deformations. And what we did then is that we basically said, okay, this single template is what's built in the brain, and a graphics engine and an inverse graphics engine, okay? And What we then did is we just fed some natural images of 100 identities. We trained the CNN on this very crappy model. And what we got were some initial fits that look kind of okayish, but not very good. We then ran our inference mechanism to get a much better fit. And we then tried to improve the model. So to learn the model based on those observations. The very critical step in this whole pipeline was kind of a quality control, that basically after each step we said like, okay, we are happy with this result or not. And the hard part was to make this quality control fully automatic. If you're interested in that, the paper is on arXiv, and I'm also happy to guide you through it more. And then we are not only working on faces, we also have some medical applications. So the Regensburg breast shape model is recent work I was involved in. It's basically exactly the same as the face model, and such models are built for almost all body parts. The breast shape model has some clinical applications for plastic surgery or recovery after surgery, reconstruction after surgery, or bra fitting. So there are various different applications on the clinical side or on the fabric cloth production side. Another project in a clinical direction is to support the diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome. So for fetal alcohol syndrome, the diagnosis works with 3 components, and one component of the diagnosis is some features of the face. And those features are very hard to retrieve if you're not a trained professional. So the idea of this project was that you could feed a 2D image, we would do the 3D reconstruction, and then extract those features that are relevant for the diagnosis. So those are just different current applications that we are exploring for those 3D morphable models. And now I would like to start with what I actually promised you. I lost a bit track of time, but I think I'm fine time-wise. And that's the identity-expression ambiguity. And that's a short paper that we put together last year and presented it at the Face and Gesture conference. And the very basic idea is really to learn more about 3D morphable models, and in particular learn more about how they model identity and expression. And I just want to quickly present to you 2 different ambiguities that were previously explored. One of them is the color illumination ambiguity, and that's something that you might know from classic experiments where you have a red ball and you have a green light, and then you can't really tell what color the ball has. And then, of course, we use priors to resolve those ambiguities. And what we presented here is that such ambiguities also hold for faces. So if you have a different light condition, you can't really tell if the face under ambient light would have a very light or a different skin tone. So this color illumination ambiguity also holds for faces, and in practice we just resolved that with a strong prior from the model. Then there is the perspective face shape ambiguity. You might know that when you take a selfie. So the problem is if the camera is further away than 1 meter, you can basically almost ignore all of that. And you can also see that in those visualizations. But if you get closer than 1 meter with the camera, you have some perspective distortions. And then it's very hard to estimate with the algorithm how far the camera is away and which part of the distortion is actually your face shape. And there's also a paper that basically only studies that ambiguity. So what we were wondering is how those 2 models, the identity and the expression model, would overlap. So for this, we just ignore the albedo and texture completely. So, and for that, I just want to show you 2 basics on how those models are built. So for the identity model, what we have is basically a mean, and the covariance matrix. So we have the mean and the variance, and that's it. And that gives us the identity. The identity model is built from those 200 scans that I've shown you before. The expression model is then basically just added to the identity model. So we have a second covariance matrix, and we have a second set of parameters. And if you look at the image here, what you see is how the expression model was collected. It's all the same person, so it's all the same identity, and there are various expressions, and we basically tried to fix the identity, have various expressions, to have a completely identity-free expression space, okay? So this space of expressions shouldn't contain any identity. And if you read in the first paper that proposed such an expression model, it was written, we have observed that the identity space contains a bit of expressions, mainly smiles, which is due to the difficulty of acquiring perfect neutral expressions. So in that paper, they observed that not everybody has the same face expression if you tell them they should have a neutral expression, and that's what we asked them to do in the scanner. And then they assumed that that's the reason why they observed some smiles in the model. What we then basically did is we investigated how far this ambiguity goes. So what we did is we generated a random sample from our model. So this random sample is random identity, random facial expression. And we tried to reconstruct this random sample with only the identity model. So this is the reconstruction where we don't change the expression parameters at all. It's the reconstruction of the random sample you see on the left with solely the identity model. And what you see here is the same, but now we leave the expression model out. So this is, the identity model out. So this is the reconstruction solely based on the expression model. And for me, this was quite shocking because at least the reconstruction in the middle looks almost perfect. The reconstruction on the right doesn't look quite perfect, but I would say it still conserves a lot of the identity-related features from the random sample on the left. And now you could, of course, say, like, that's cherry-picked, so I will show you some other examples. This is a different one. Again, the reconstruction with solely identity looks almost identical. The reconstruction with solely the expression looks a little bit different, but still gets the rough overall face shape. And then there is just one more example where you can see how much of the identity or the expression is preserved in both cases. And then we were wondering why that happens. So it could just be that we did something wrong when we built the model. And all the experiments that I've shown you so far were on the Basel face model. And there are other Morphable models that are publicly available. One of them is from Tübingen. So we thought, like, let's look at that model, that's the flame model, and see if it also suffers from this ambiguity. And those are the reconstructions that we get. And we basically observe very much the same as we have seen before with the Basel face model. And this flame model, there is no single researcher that was involved in both models, but it still has some common ideas. We start with face scans, we somehow establish correspondence. All the algorithms are slightly different, but a lot of the basic ideas are very much the same. So we thought, let's also take a learned model. So this model is learned from 2D images and some supervision, but it has never seen a 3D scan. And we observe basically the exact same ambiguity for that model. But for that model, we also observed that the variance it explains is much lower. So a lot of those faces look very similar. If we just generate random samples, they look almost the same in this model. The next step we did is we were looking at actual numbers. So it's always nice to have a visualization, and with faces, it's of course like we can just look at them and get an idea. But we also wanted to see how good or how bad it actually performs. So this is again for the 3 models that I've shown you before. The blue line is the reconstruction quality of the full model, so of the model with identity and expression. And on the x-axis, you see the number of parameters. Since it's a principal component analysis model, we can take more and more parameter and get a better and better reconstruction. And on the y-axis, you see the reconstruction error in millimeters. And what you can observe is that with one of both models, either only the identity or only the expression models, we just need some more parameters, but we can reconstruct the face almost as good as with the full model. You can also see that there is a slight difference with the Basel face model compared to the Flame and the Lermomo model. For both those other models, the expression model seems to be less powerful to explain the identity variation, but 2 millimeters of approximation error is not that high, so those reconstructions are visually still very similar. The next thing we were wondering is if that could just be an effect of noise in our model, because on a mathematical level, our model is doing some black magic. We have like 50,000 parameters, and we only have 200 data points, and then we assume a Gaussian, and that might just be wrong. So we have a lot of noise in our model, so it could just be caused by that noise. So we were wondering if this ambiguity would still hold if we only look at the first or the second principal component. So what you see here is if we do 1 or 2 standard deviations of the first principal component, and the lower face is for the second principal component. And then we basically did the same as we did before, that we tried to reconstruct it solely with the expression model and solely with the identity model, and look on how good that reconstruction looks like. And what you can see is that in the first principal component, the reconstruction is not quite as good, but in the second principal component, we are already getting much closer. And we did the same for the expression model and tried to recover it with the identity model. And there we visually see only a very small difference. There is also, again, a mathematical way to measure that. And that way that we explored is the angles between flats measure. And what it basically means, if the measure would be pi half, it would mean the two models would be orthogonal. So pi half would be around 1.5. And as you can see, for the first component, it's almost orthogonal. But the moment we add more components, the orthogonality is almost gone and drops very quickly. If it would hit 0, it would actually be completely overlapping, which is in our case not the case. Then we were wondering if what we found with this ambiguity is scientific sugar, or if it might actually be relevant in practice. So what we did is we just studied this effect on the task that I have shown you before. So we feed in target images, and we would like to reconstruct those target images either with the full model or with the identity model or only the expression model. Okay, I have to take a 1 minute break.
All right, so if we want, I guess we could discuss some of the things that we've seen so far to bridge the time. I don't know. I feel like, Peter, this falls totally within your domain of expertise with the rendering and the modeling and whatnot, no?
Yeah, I'm certainly envious of the models. I should, because I've got so many 3D scans of my own. I've always wanted to try building a model. I might need to have a chat with him about how to do so.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. It will happen twice more and then we are done. The reconstructions that you can see here are with the full model. On the left, it's the reconstruction basically in the same space as the image. And on the right, you can see the extracted 3D shape. The numbers below are how likely that reconstruction is and the reconstruction error. And for the reconstruction error, we don't have ground truths. So what we take here as ground truths is the reconstruction from the full model. We then do the reconstruction with solely the identity model. And you can see that now we have a reconstruction error, but visually those reconstructions look very, very similar. And we also did the reconstruction with solely the expression model, and you can again observe that the reconstructions are very, very similar. The one thing that's really bothering here is that if you look at the left number, that's how likely that reconstruction is under our prior. and we basically observed that all those reconstructions are almost equally likely. And that's a big issue, because that basically means that in practice, we can't really tell expression and identity cost variation of those faces apart in the inverse setting. And that might be the part that could be interesting from a cognitive science perspective. So in this computer vision setting, we see that we can't really tell some expression cost variation and some identity cost variation apart. If we go back to the original statement in the paper, we can definitely say it's not only mainly smiles, it's much more. And this ambiguity might just be relevant in practice, but might also be very interesting, and I think also very interesting when we think about how the human brain might process faces. So I came up with a list of questions that raises for me, and the first question is just the observation basically translated from this morphable model space to the space of faces, because it would still be possible that we just did something wrong in our analysis. But basically, if this observation that we have in the 3D morphable model space is correct, then that means that the intraperson variation at the population level overlaps with the interperson variation. So the intraperson variation is the expression variation, and the interperson variation is the identity variation, and they might just heavily overlap on a population level. And that might make it very hard to then try to perceive faces. Then a question that you might be able to respond better to than I can is how faces are processed. So some people think identity and expression are processed separately. Some people think they are processed together. With this observation, it might just be very hard to really separate them. So it might not make all that much sense to really try to process them separately, or to think in a framework where they are processed separately. One thing that we, of course, have to think about when we talk about a neutral face or an identity model is, what is a neutral facial expression? And is that actually something that we could collect? And my current understanding is that the neutral expression might just be something that we try to estimate when we familiarize ourselves with a new person. So that's just my current understanding. I don't know if anybody shares that. But if I meet a new person, my imagination is that I basically try to find a mean or the neutral expression of that person to be better able to interpret the facial expressions of that person. And then I basically separate it, but I do that person by person, and I can only do that by interacting with the person or by having a lot of images of that person. And the last one might be a far reach, but this identity expression ambiguity, together with a lot of other ambiguities, might be one of the reasons why it's so incredibly hard for us to separate identities of people that we have not met before. And in this example here from Jenkins, you of course see that it's not only the expression and identity variation and illumination variation. There is also a variation in how old those two guys are, or their haircut, or if they shaved or not. So there is definitely much more variation. But I think part of this image we could potentially be able to explain with this expression identity ambiguity. So Maike, you have to tell me if you usually stop on time or if I should dive into a small other thing for 10 minutes.
I would say there is usually no time constraints because everyone can come and go as they please.
Okay,
so
perfect.
If you're okay, everyone with it, then I would say simply continue.
Okay, so I would like to go back to the image that I started with, this Mooney image, because it's something that we played around with. We didn't really publish a real paper on it, but I think it's very interesting, and we did some experiments. and we also have some first findings, and I would just like to share one idea on how we could be able to understand such images, motivated from this inverse graphics, computer graphics engine in the brain idea. And the very basic idea here would be that what we see here is just an extrapolation of a very extreme illumination condition. Okay, so if I take this image here on the left, it's kind of an extreme illumination condition. And what we see on the right, I would argue that that's just the same. It's of course the same underlying image, but it's just like somehow extrapolating in this direction. It's just much more extreme. But we can still somehow parse it using our inverse graphics system. And in the next 3 slides, I just want to convince you that that idea might have something, okay? So what we did here is that we do something similar as we did with the faces before. We learn a space of illumination conditions, of natural illumination conditions. So we have a distribution of illumination conditions. And then what we can do is on the left here, that would be the average illumination condition, okay? The average illumination condition based on 15,000 face images. And what you see here is the illumination condition that we get when we run our inverse graphics framework on this image. So we get an illumination condition that's already pretty extreme. It's not a super likely illumination condition. So it's somewhere in or out or almost outside this distribution. And what we can then do is we extrapolate. So we go away from the mean in the direction of this illumination condition, and we make it more and more extreme. And what I would like to convince you is that we don't have to go that far that it starts to look almost like a Mooney face. Okay? It doesn't look completely like a Mooney face, but it goes into that direction. And I would argue that it's not actually that far. It's just like 20 or 30% more in the direction of that illumination space. And we can also go the opposite way. So we can take an image and we try to recover the 3D face from that Mooney image. So what we did here is we just used the exact same inference algorithm as before, and we try to reconstruct a 3D face and try to estimate the illumination. And what you see is this is the estimated illumination, and it's kind of a very weird illumination condition, but you don't have to go that far back, and it's again something realistic. So we said that could be a way how we could be able to interpret those Mooney faces. And it might just be very limited by the illumination model that we are using, because this illumination model is very simplified. It only has 9 parameters. And one way to kind of support this claim is to study what happens if we change the contrast polarity. So if we take this image and everything that was black before turns into white, and everything that was white before turns into black. And what for most humans apply is that on the left image, it's very easy to spot the face, and we get a very rich percept, like we kind of can say something about the face. And on the right, a lot of that rich percept is gone, and it's much harder to see a face in that image. And then we ran our inverse pipeline on both of them. And what we see on the left, we can find a consistent explanation of a face shape based on our prior, of an illumination condition based on our illumination prior. And on the right, it just gets heavily distorted. It can't really find a reasonable illumination condition, and the reconstruction is much more unlikely, and it also doesn't really reflect what we see in the image. We can also visualize the illumination condition. For the left image, the illumination condition that we see is that's visualized on a sphere. So you have to imagine that there is a strong light source on the top right of the head. And the other illumination condition there is light from top and bottom from two sides, which is just a very unlikely illumination condition under our illumination prior. Okay, and before I give you time to ask questions, I would just like to show you some more faces. Those are all the awesome people I had the pleasure to work with in the last 10 years with all their names. There are people from Basel, and there are people from MIT, and now already the first ones here from FAU. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer all your critical or not so critical questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Bernhard. I'm going to stop the recording now because no one needs to hear my stuff noise. Let's just go ahead and ask any questions, those who are there.